Hello and welcome to another music talk. We're talking this time about timbre, musical timbre, color of sound. This is on the more abstract side of things, in part because the way that we talk about it, musicians anyway, we don't have a notation system for this as such. We only have adjectives. And as such, this is actually one of the best ways to connect with other arts because you can use certain types of words to describe many different types of experiences, phenomenon, things in the universe. Um, when we talk about melody, we can start talking about frequency and measurable scientific things, and rhythm. We can talk about time and interpretation, so it can be kind of nailed down on paper a little bit more. But in this case, we're talking more about evocative aspects of music, and as such, this along with harmony, which we're going to talk about in an upcoming unit, are going to be the things that strike your audience first. Before they have a chance to hear the story that the music is telling, before they have a chance to hear dynamic range and really get a sense of rhythm and tempo, they're going to be able to instantly pick up timbre. The same way that you only need to hear a couple words from someone speaking to be able to identify, oh, that's someone I know, or that's someone I might know, or that's someone I definitely haven't heard before. It's kind of an oral thumbprint or fingerprint. I don't need these yet. I'm going to take them off. So, timbre. First of all, it's very commonly mispronounced timbre. Because of it's the way it's spelled, Timbre. But timbre. So just to give you an operating definition of it, it is, if you want to just summarize it quickly, it's the tonal quality or color of sound. Anything beyond that, and we start to get a little bit subjective with it. And as I mentioned before, we're talking about using adjectives here, strictly speaking, to describe it. Now, later on, we're going to go into talking about how to categorize certain instruments, and those will have a much more organized system for talking about the different instruments and the sounds that they produce and the different audio effects. We're going to be talking about them basically akin to filters that you can put on a photograph, on a picture, to make it come across differently. But for starters, if we're just going to use these descriptors, the most effective adjectives that we're going to use to describe timbre are ones that describe temperature. So hot, cold, brisk, weather. Right, wet sounds versus dry sounds are very commonly expressed, and you can. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to be able to figure out when you hear, for example, a snare drum in a small room, which you're going to hear shortly. Right, that by itself is a dry sound. So how do we make it wet? Right, those sorts of things we're going to talk about. Appearance related adjectives, dark, warm, harsh, earthy, and again, we're talking about what abstract ways to describe the nature of the sound, right? And we're not talking about necessarily that sounds like a percussion instrument, that sounds like a brass instrument. Brass instruments have certain timbres, so you could say that, but we're talking right now, as I normally like to include, we're talking more at the 10,000 foot level, right? And then we're going to come down to earth and use a little bit more specific terminology as we go through this. Some of the things that we're going to listen to are basically different versions, different arrangements of the same musical compositions played by different combinations of instruments, of different instruments. This is really the best way to assess timbre because, well, a certain melody may have a certain, let's say it's joyous, right? And a lot of times it's easy to conflate the timbre of the music with the character of the melody or the harmony, the mood that is being brought into it. And so a lot of times there will be a tune you can hear, and this is a mistake that I felt I'm trying to correct in the way I talk about this because I used to not present it this way, but now I am presenting it where you get to hear a few different versions of the same exact material. So it might be a joyous melody, whatever. I'm speaking in abstract terms again, nothing specific right now. We're going to listen to some Debussy, so there are some joyous moments in that. And there are some more complex moments of introspection within the music. And the original version of his string quartet is obviously it's 2 violins, viola, and cello. That's the instrumentation for a string quartet. Very commonly people say, oh, violin, viola, cello, bass. And you would think that, but actually string quartet, the defined combination of instruments is got 2 violins, a cello, and a viola. But I digress. But we're going to listen to that same piece of music then played by a marimba quartet so that you can really tell what is in the DNA of the piece that does translate when you change the instruments and what doesn't translate. This is one of the things that when you first start to collaborate with other musicians, one of the coolest things that you can do that won't result in as much of a potential for, dashed expectations is to take a version of a song or a piece, right? We know the difference between those two things, right? A song versus a piece. To take and find instrumentalists that play completely different instruments and say, I would like you to adapt this song for your clarinet ensemble, something like that. So that's obviously it based on what type of material you use at first or not. It can be really, the results can really work, or it might take a lot of finagling to really figure out how best to transport the material. But when we talk about arranging, it's that process. If you haven't heard that term before, musical arranging is just adapting material for different circumstances. So right now I've been talking about changing instruments, but you can also use it to arranging to change styles. This is a little bit of a tangent here. Change styles, change the length of the song, change the difficulty level. A lot of times, like in school band, there will be easier arrangements of things. I wonder how often that's done with choreography. That might be an interesting aspect, is to take something and simplify it for students or excerpt it for students. That I'm curious to know, if you have any experience with that. That's and how the arrangement concept works in other media, in other art forms. Anyway, back on track. Back to timbre. Timbre. Oof, I just made the mistake. Sorry. So when you listen to 2 different versions of the same tune, the same song, the same piece, using all those words interchangeably because I'm not being specific about anything right now, and you hear them with different instruments, same material, that's when you're really examining timbre. Go on a little bit here. Something to clarify. When you are talking about timbre, we're talking about differences. We're not talking about differences in pitch. So, for example, like a guitar, a kazoo, and an operatic tenor can all produce the same exact note, right, on the piano. They can all produce that note, for example. That does, and timbre is being able to tell which one of those things, right? Right now you can hear that this is a piano, but timbre is being able to tell, even on the same note, what instrument is going on, and not confuse them. Timbre is the basic sonic identity of an instrument. Again, I used the thumbprint or fingerprint, oral fingerprint before. It's based on the shape, size, and material of whatever object is producing the sound. We all have the beginnings of being able to guess what types of sound. If you see an instrument made out of wood versus an instrument made out of metal, right? For example, like you would be able to, if someone struck an object, you'd be able to tell if it was metal or wood, right? There's a rope clanging on a flagpole. You can hear the metal nature of that sound, and that's part of what we're talking about. In the world of percussion, the three main materials are wood, metal, skin, right? So drums, right? That sort of thing. And then we also have synthetic instruments, and that's when we talk about percussion instruments. If you've ever heard of the legendary Stradivarius violin, viola, cello, Stradivarius was a maker of string instruments a few hundred years ago, right? The exact year is losing me right now, but you know what? I will look it up real quick and make sure I get the right number. Late 17th, early 18th century. I looked it up real quick. So that's about the same time that Johann Sebastian Bach was around. It was before Mozart. It was before Beethoven. And if you know anything about these instruments, a lot of times the thing you'll hear about it, there was something that happened years ago where a cellist left his Stradivarius cello in a taxi in New York City and ended up it made news. Well, not because he was forgetful, but because the instrument cost about $4 million. Now you could ask, why on earth would an instrument be worth that much? And the answer is timbre. The Stradivarius happened to be crafting instruments, as you might be able to infer from his name, Italian gentleman, and he happened to live, it was a little bit of a coincidence, during a time that geologists call a mini ice age. So there was a period in Europe where the temperatures happened to drop precipitously. You had this, as the name implies, a small scale global climate change where things got colder. And during that time, the wood that would normally be used to create instruments, the trees that were used to create the wood, you get it. They had to be a lot hardier to survive, and they also didn't get as much nutrients. So what ended up happening is, you look at the rings of a tree to see, how old it is, and they noticed that the rings in the wood that he made his instruments out of were really, really close together. It was very dense. It was kind of trial by um, deprivation for these trees. And as a result, the wood was a lot denser. It had just a different quality to it. And then you can imagine after that period of time, trees, mini ice age over, we're going back. The trees had an easier time to exist, and so the wood changed back to a little bit more of what we're used to in the modern era. But the instruments, and they're still around, and very commonly there will be an orchestra will own a few or a collection of these instruments, and the players will get to use them for their time in the orchestra, or schools will allow, like for example, Juilliard, I believe they own a couple of these or have access to a couple of these, where they allow some of their students to use them. It's very rare that the player, his or herself, actually owns these instruments, just because they're so valuable. And it's come to now that people have gotten so interested in reproducing this, and this is all, again, to get a quality of sound, a richness, a fullness, a complexity of sound in these instruments, that people have gone to the lengths of trying to reproduce these mini ice age conditions so that trees can grow the same way. As you can imagine, well, those, even though they're not very old, and you can make more of them, that's still a lot of resources to put into an instrument. So not knowing much about those offhand, I can still imagine they're going to be quite expensive. And all of this is to seek a sound quality, right? That's pretty substantial when you think about it. So now, I mentioned before about the size and shape and material of the vibrating object. So vibrations, we know that sound is produced by vibration, and we're going to get into a couple terms here, right? If you want to check your notes, but in general, organology is basically a system of categorizing how those vibrations are produced. Now, some of this, when we talk about it, is going to seem like, oh, I think I've learned this before. Woodwinds and brass and strings and percussion. It's related to that. But I want you to pretend that those categories, for the time being, pretend that those categories do not exist, right? And we just have all sound, all instruments, and they're waiting to be assigned a house, right? Assigned a place to live, assigned a club to belong to, right? So we're going to talk about the qualifications for each of these clubs, right? And the overall categorization process is called organology. Organ, like instrument, like, for example, church organ, or, something, bodily. You have organs that function and do different things in different ways. So we're going to talk about how to categorize these things. They are chiefly determined by the actions that create the vibration, right? So organology equals, or is defined and separated out by action type, right? So I want you, if you're thinking about this as a way to relate to movement is crucial to the way instrumentalists do their thing. It just so happens that movement is not an ends, it's a means, right? But I often look, if you watch an orchestra perform, and you watch live musicians perform, if and when you get a chance to do that, or a recording of a concert, you'll notice there's a lot of visual stimulus going on. And even though musicians, their bodily movement might not be as graceful and as coordinated, when they're playing, that is every bit as planned out and as nuanced as any kind of choreography that you could come across. And the difference is the scale and the purpose before it. So it's just a way to unite, two seemingly disparate art forms, right? Music and dance. They've always been connected, but this is another way to connect them. So, first organology category, and all of these end with the suffix means, the end of the word, ophone, right? Sound, right? And the first one is chordophone. Chord as in a chord or string, right? And these are instruments with one or more, I'm going to read it out for you in a sing-song manner. Instrument with one or more strings stretched between fixed points. One or more strings stretched, so that implies tension, fixed point, right? So that there has to be something that it's affixed to, some sort of body. So, question for you, and I want you this to be a moment to see if you can name a couple actions that are used to produce sound on chordophone, right? So remember I talked a moment ago about how actions are crucial in producing different types of sound. So I want you to think about different stringed instruments and what are the actions that you would use to create sound on that, right? I'm going to give you a second. I want you to pause the video for a moment and see if you can name 3, right? I'll give you a little countdown. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So the most common string instrument people see on a regular basis is probably the guitar. So how would you play guitar? Well, you strum, you pluck, you can tap, you can slide in some cases. Those are different techniques that you can manifest different sounds and different articulations on. All right, if we go to the bowed instruments, well, we have obviously bowing, right? That's a type of friction. We have a horsehair bow. Actually, I'll pause it. I'll go get one for better illustration. Okay, so this happens to be a bass bow. I have a few of these because we actually, as percussionists, sometimes will actually use these. So, and this is horsehair right here. And so the action of the bow, the friction that the bow uses on the instrument. Violinists will also pluck. If you think of harp players, they will also do, in some cases, what's called a glissando, which means slide, right? It's kind of they graze the strings up and down, which is a variation on strumming. But either way, these instruments have some vaguely related percussive motions to them, right? Because strumming is kind of like a variation on hitting. You could start to make some connections. Basically, this is a little sarcasm coming at you, but I'm trying to tie everything back to percussion because I'm a percussionist and I want to elevate my art. It doesn't need help. It doesn't need help for me. So we're going to listen to some contrasting examples of using the bow, using what's called pizzicato, which is that plucking technique. We're going to use, and we'll listen to some other guitar examples that use more extended techniques on the instrument that start to really blur the lines between string and percussion instruments. And if anybody has ever seen flamenco guitar, you'll know what I'm talking about by using the body of the guitar as a drum and an accompanying instrument. So the whole idea and the goal here in general for this particular unit is to really tune your ears in, really get specific and be able to hear, okay, that sounds like a bowed violin versus that sounds like pizzicato. That's probably fairly easy enough if you care to listen to it. The more of these things you can pick up, the more you can appreciate quality and distinctions between various recordings, various performers, various performances. of different things, right? There a lot of times you'll find a piece of music, if you're finding a live recording of it or a different studio release. For example, Jacob Collier, if anybody here is a fan of his, he does different versions of his songs very often, and so you can listen for, all right, well, are there some different string techniques being used? For example, that's just one random thing that you could use to help distinguish, and then decide, all right, well, which one suits my needs at the moment? If you're choosing music for some dance-related purpose, but being able to hear them and use them. So that was chordophones. Chordophones. I'll also type it for you. All right, moving on. Next organology category. Drum roll. It's not drums. Aerophones. Spelled kind of like Aerosmith, right? If you ever heard of that band. Aerophones. Aerophones. This just phonetically sounds like the word air, and so that this is an instrument in which moving air is the principal means of vibration. Moving air. So we have anything from a simple instrument such as a whistle, simple aerophone, to a French horn, which sometimes a lot of people argue is the most difficult musical instrument to master. Obviously, that's there's some argument to be made for depending on what's being done, but in general, aerophone, you're pushing a column of air, either a straight column or one that has been kind of spiralized or twisted in some fashion, through a tube at higher pressure than the outside air. Right, so you have lung power, human lung power. So within those old categories that I told you to forget, I'm going to briefly restore your memory just for the next 10 seconds. So this would be woodwinds and brass instruments, in addition to, again, whistles. And I have more whistles, but I'm going to spare you for these other things. The frequency of this, the pitch, right, determining where we are in terms of the geography of the piano, is determined by the length of the tube. So the longer the tubing is, the lower the frequency. You already know this because when you see a tuba and you see a flute, you're not going to be surprised which one produces the lower note, right? This is just kind of a common sense thing put into slightly more scientific terms so that you can sound smarter when you're talking about it, and also so it has a little bit more basis in a measurable phenomenon. And see if you can name a few aerophones right now. So this is another moment. Pause the video. See if you can name 3. Right? And I'll come back in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so Woodwind Instruments. Again, this is that category I told you to forget, but your memory's back for a second. Woodwind Instruments would be flute, clarinet, saxophone. Saxophone's a woodwind instrument, even though it looks like a brass instrument. If you're curious, we can talk more about why. That's not crucial right now. Trombone, trumpet, the aforementioned French horn, harmonica, kazoo. Again, we mentioned kazoo. Those are all... sorry, French horn is not a woodwind instrument. Harmonica is. These all have a vibrating reed. Oboe, bassoon, those are all woodwind instruments. Brass instruments would be trumpet, trombone, tuba, baritone, flugelhorn, which is kind of a jazzier, more mellow type of trumpet. Then also the bugle, which is the military trumpet that doesn't have valves. And when we talk about changing the length of air, all those valves or the buttons on the instruments do is change how much of the tubing the air is going through. That's what it's doing. So if you're using all of the tubing, you are generally going to be playing the lowest possible notes of that instrument. Now there's a little bit more to it, but in general, as you start to close off different passages, then you start to produce higher notes. There's more, especially with brass instruments, there's more to it than that. But that's just a general way to understand how the instruments operate and how they produce their sound. Moving on. When we talk about aerophones, we have to talk about another term that I'm going to throw out there called embouchure. And this is the use of the facial muscles and the shaping of the lips to the mouthpiece, and how that affects the player's overall sound. This is to make a dance musician analogy. This is very much like turnout, or how your movement tracks with itself, your alignment, and how you kind of set yourself up for doing anything, right? Your general, how grounded are you? But it really, like, turnout is a very comparable term, in that some people are better suited for certain positions, and some people are better suited for others. And yes, you can work towards getting better at things that you're not naturally as good at first, but there are different human beings that are slightly better suited. For example, like, my hands, as an instrumentalist, are not great for being a trumpet player. My fingers aren't strong enough, right? That's something. So, and I actually used to be a trumpet player a long time ago. The only thing I got left is the hat, right? But the idea is that there are certain physical tasks that you have to perform. In this case, with your mouth, as we're talking about embouchure. And you can develop those muscles, but then there's also certain things that can make you slightly, make it slightly easier to play certain instruments, or slightly harder. We're going to listen to a few examples, and I'll link these. You'll be able to see these. A few different examples of woodwind instruments, a few different examples of brass instruments, and they're all different. I'm being nice in this way, in that they're all different tunes. So, for example, like the Oboe Solo from, I believe it's Samuel Barber's Violin Concerto. And then we're going to listen to a little bit of clarinet from Rhapsody in Blue. They're entirely different styles, entirely different, pieces of music. But they also happen to be really good at demonstrating what those particular instruments are good at. We're also going to listen to, for brass players, some different examples of mutes, which is a way that brass players can change the color of their sounds. These mutes are basically just objects that are inserted into the bell of the instrument, the open part of the instrument, opposite of the mouthpiece. And the farthest part away from the embouchure, to tie it back into the term that I just used. And they can, well, as the term suggests, muting or make the sound more subdued. But when we listen to, for example, Miles Davis use what's called a Harmon mute, that's not just softer. It has a sizzle to it, almost. And it's, in a time before electronic effects became much more commonplace. Well, if you wanted to create an interesting sound, you had to look around and see what was available to you. One of the most famous types of mutes is the plunger mute, and it is what it sounds like. It is a plunger end from a piece of plumbing equipment, right, used in a sanitary fashion, but used to cover and uncover the end of the brass instrument so that you get a wah-wah effect. And this is something that everybody's heard to some degree or another. Really entertaining effect, and very, it captures your attention pretty nicely. All right, now we're coming into home turf for me. Next, organology category. So far, we had, well, chordophone, aerophone, and now we have membranophone, an instrument with a stretched membrane, drums, right? The next two categories, membranophone and the following one, which is called idiophone, are all percussion instruments. And the difference between the two of them has to do with the complexity of the construction, not necessarily how you play them as much as how is the instrument put together, how complicated is it versus how simple it is. A lot of times when people say, drums were the first instruments, well, technically, membranophones, which we're about to talk about, are kind of complex, right? And I'll switch over. I have a little camera shot so you can see, in this case, just to remind you that, those drums, those two drums right there, I have a snare drum and a djembe, I can't imagine real early Homo sapiens being able to put together something like that. But what I can imagine them being able to do is to, produce something that sounds like a woodblock, right? That's a lot easier to imagine. It's not a drum, though. Membranophones. That's what we're talking about now. We'll get to the other category, the non-drum category. We're talking about drums at the moment. And just for a quick definition, it's an instrument which vibrates by means of a tightly stretched skin or membrane, such as a drum. This is a kind of a textbook definition I'm reading out to you. I don't know what else applies here. Maybe a banjo, but the drum part of a banjo, and there is kind of like a drum built into the instrument there, is kind of secondary to the strings. You can have banjo sound without that drum head there, but you can't have it without the strings, right? The pluckiness to it. So now you guys have experience with drums. You've played them, you put your hands on them, you've had to distinguish what is a quote-unquote high drum from a low drum, if you remember that from a couple years ago. And so some of this will be a little bit more intuitive just because you've had hands-on experience with this. So how do the construction, the size, and the shape affect the sound of the drum? Well, the depth of the drum, how, from the playing surface to the bottom of it, how deep that shell is, the body of the instrument, is going to determine the potential for volume of the instrument. So taller drums can produce a more substantial column of air. They can move more air, which will result in a louder sound. So think long and loud, right? That's a way to think of it. And soft and shallow. And as a matter of fact, there will be some videos that we can watch that will demonstrate how a very shallow drum can play whisper quietly, and how a very deep drum can produce a cannon shot type of sound. That's actually a term that people use for bass drums that you see in orchestras. These big bass drums that are more than 3 feet across, and you got to somehow produce a cohesive sound on this thing that has focus to it and has boom and rumble to it, which are great affects. Here's an interesting thing, though. It represents potential volume, not guaranteed volume. And it just as a quick tangent, and if you want to skip my little story, you can skip this, but I once got accosted on my way into a gig at a venue. It was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and I was hired to bring 4 timpani to this, right, kettle drums, and they're sitting over there. Maybe I'll take a picture. I'll show them to you guys. But in any case, like the big one is about 3 feet across, and I had 4 of them. And the manager for this place, like basically, who had nothing to do with hiring me for this little chamber orchestra gig, was like, no, you can't bring those in here. You can't. We're not allowed to. We said no amplification, no loud music. And my I could go further into our exchange there, but it's not going to be really relevant to this class. The point he was demonstrating was that he thought because they were big, the only sound that they could make was thunderous. And, you know, I very politely as I could at the moment, told him that I was hired to bring these, and if there was an issue, he needed to take it up with the person who told me to bring them. But ironically, I was one of the softest people on that gig, not least because I didn't want 1 second of attention from being a loud musician there. So don't be fooled by size and necessary volume, right? Potential volume is there, most likely, but necessary, you know, that's like looking at a tuba and saying the only thing it can do is notes that blow your doors down. Not really, right? It might be capable of that, but it can also do a lot more shades of potential decibel count. So we got shallow versus deep drums. The diameter, and this is the thing that you guys maybe even a couple years ago you got annoyed by having to remember all the time: big versus small, high versus low, narrow versus wide. Narrow produces a higher pitch, and because it's less material, that stretched membrane, there's less of it to vibrate. So just like the air column in the aerophones we talked about before, about, you know, opening up more of that to produce lower sounds. In this case, it's the kind of the surface area of the head that can produce the again it's potential for low sounds. They can be adjusted. That's one of the main things that makes drums a complex instrument, is their potential for adjustment, right? And I'll show it to you in a minute. You know, there's the crucial one little key. It's literally called a drum key that all drummers have, that they use to tune drums. And sometimes when people hear that, they think, oh, that's tuned drums. Why? I mean, you may have seen people do that many times as they're getting set up for either, you know, accompanying or for a performance or something like that. That may not be as foreign to you as it is for some people. But a lot of times people will be surprised that drums are indeed adjustable. But in general, once you see the size of the drum head, let me get one in front of you. Once you see the size of the drum head, and so this is actually a 14-inch snare drum head. This is the last one I used over at Fiddler when I was over there on the off-Broadway. And this is kind of like a medium to large size. So it's a pretty versatile size, but this is also a good kind of Mason-Dixon line. Like, things that are smaller than this would be considered a smaller or higher pitched. This is like the middle C of drum heads, basically. That's a way of thinking of it, right? It sits right in the range of drums. Just to give you a general sense of how the size relates to the sound and the range of it. This is also a plastic drum head, and most of the music that you hear with real drums being played is being produced with plastic drum heads. Before about 1954, which is when the plastic drum head was made widely available, every drum in the history of planet Earth was made using animal skin for the drum head. That's why they're called skins sometimes. Sometimes people want to refer to drums in a slang fashion, so they'll call them skins. And so for this, well, what's the advantage of skins? Well, not a lot, right? There are still some adherents to using animal skin drums, and they all have to do with timbre, because you can hear when something is plastic. You know, even if you're just knocking your finger on it, you know, a piece of plastic, you can hear that, and you can also, you know, kind of pick up the limitations. It's a simpler sound. It's a less complex sound. Musicians generally want to have a complex. They want the potential for a lot of different natured sounds in their instrument. And professional orchestras, for example, we'll talk about, you know, Western music. Professional orchestras But as well as, you know, if we're talking about djembes in coming out of Conakry in Guinea, West Africa, they will. I don't think it has as much to do with availability. It's still a preference for the sound. In both cases, you'll have timpanists and snare drummers who have either calf skin or goat skin on their drums. Djembe, the djembe that I have just over here, is an instrument that has, you can see it right there. That's a goat skin head. So drums, if you have vegan tendencies or vegan leanings, then plastic, as much as we're not a fan of environmentally what that can do in some cases, plastic heads are vegan drum heads, so they do end up saving animals, which is not a bad thing. Musicians who are otherwise ethically not conflicted when it comes to this, sometimes there is legitimate conflict in their minds because they, synthetic versus natural materials will limit their options. We talk about the head materials, also the shell materials, right? The difference between a wood shell or a metal shell or a ceramic shell that can help to create a different voice of the instrument. So again, it's the materials that we're talking about here. Last, acoustic category of organology. We have one more, and by me being specific about acoustic, you might be able to guess what this last one's going to be after this idiophone category. Idiophone, I-D-I-O-P-H-O-N-E. Idio, like self-oriented. That prefix. So I just looked it up real quick. A combining word form meaning proper to one or peculiar to one. So idiomatic, idiom, those are related words. Idiomatic meaning, for example, if I'm playing a piece of music that feels like it suits my instrument well, in that case that would be an idiomatic composition. Idiom is kind of like genre, but when we talk about idiophones, an instrument which is sounded by the substance of the instrument itself. Yeesh. Okay, remember this is a percussion instrument. So when we talk about idiophones, we are talking about something that is going to be using one of the three principal actions on the percussion instruments. Now this might be, if you recall a couple years ago, you remember the different stroke types, bass, tone, slap. That's not what we're talking about, because those are all variations on hitting, right? Hitting is one of the three principal actions. And I'm going to step over and demonstrate some of the other ones just briefly for you. So the three principal actions that we are talking about are, well, as I just mentioned, striking, hitting, slapping, banging, any variation, anything that implies a sort of collision, right? We're talking about things that, run into each other, right? So, great example, idiophone. Right, the triangle, right? You can see that right there, and it's not hard to identify this one. It has a pretty distinct sound, single pitch, and if we're talking about percussion, why is this not a drum? Well, there's no stretched anything here, but it's also not adjustable, right? If we look at this drum right here, I can take this little drum key and make a slight adjustment. Right, I don't know if you can hear that. I'm dropping things all over the place here. But by adding some tension to it, I can raise the pitch. As a matter of fact, I'll tune it. So you can hear that the pitch is dropping as I adjust it. So this is what I was talking about a little bit before when I talked about membranophones. But when we talk about idiophone, there's no place for me to irreversibly adjust this, right? Without the instrument itself incurring some sort of damage or some sort of nature-changing event that we can't go back to the way it was, right? That's another thing that idiophones they don't adapt. They are not evolutionary in their nature. So striking, right? Triangle, striking the triangle right there. I'm headless on there. Here's another striking instrument. So you could be able to extrapolate other possibilities here, but this is a gong, right? And this one, I just chose this one because it has a nice characteristic sound. This is a Chinese opera gong, so it actually has a little question mark. It mimics the inflection of the Chinese languages, right? If you listen to that, they're actually, you can get different gongs that have different arcs to their note, right? And hopefully that is not distorting for you too much, right? Right, so that's another variation. That's another idiophone that is struck. Okay, so what is another way to play an idiophone? Well, we have scraping, right? And if you think about it, scraping is just a bunch of really close together collisions, but it's it doesn't feel the same way as when we talk about hitting something. Scraping is also kind of similar to strumming, if you want to think about it, right? So this instrument is a synthetic version of a Latin American instrument called a güiro. The G is silent. Pronunciation is not great, so I apologize for that. But it is normally made out of a hollowed out gourd, and it's got these ridges that you run a really sturdy stick against. Right, so you have that, and so if you're listening to a bolero, like a traditional bolero, not the composition, not the Ravel composition, but an actual bolero, Afro-Cuban style dance, you're listening to cha-cha-cha, they'll have this instrument in it, and this is a scraped instrument. Another more comical version of a scraped instrument that you kind of have to think a little bit more about to make the connection, but it's called a ratchet. These were and still are common when you want to have more of a sound effects sort of driven moment. A lot of times electronic triggering has made instruments like these less necessary, less common in studio settings, but Broadway you'll still find these, and certainly in contemporary composing people will still write these, but they really had their heyday back in vaudeville type of times, as you might be able to imagine. Right, so that's scraping. And last, you can probably guess what's coming because you guys have all played these instruments in some shape or form, is shaking. Right, so we had hitting, some type of collision. Then we had scraping. This is the second principal action, right? So kind of a sliding or glancing, series of collisions, and then again, it's still colliding, right? But we just have some captive material and an enclosed container, and you're just moving the captive stuff inside the container, right? right? So these are Cuban Maracas, right? I got to practice a little bit on that. I'm a little rusty. But they have a specific type of fill in them. And if you are going to want a different type of sound, for example, I have what are called, I have these Mexican maracas, so they have wooden shells, and they have a little bit more of a spark. And not to be confused with Venezuelan maracas, which have a lot more of a fine fill. You can do a lot of articulate, virtuosic things with these. I'll link some videos of some really talented players of these instruments. So in Western culture, a lot of these instruments have kind of been grouped into like what's sometimes called auxiliary instrument family. And that's not to confuse them with the fact that in their original cultures, you'll have someone who's all they do is play guira or guiro. I'll show you some really impressive samples of guira and guiro playing, and likewise maraca playing. Like that can be a specialty on its own. And then when it's kind of come into the great melting pot of American and Western concert music, they have been forced to assimilate a little bit. Another idiophone, which is right here, is the marimba. You guys have seen this from an earlier video. And when we talk about timbre, so this is, this looks like a very complex instrument. And you might ask, well, why is this, I thought idiophones were supposed to be simple and membranophones were complex. At its core, this instrument is just a few dozen pieces of wood, right? The rest of it that's been constructed to make it portable and louder is the complicated part, all right? And that's what makes it more modern. But at its core, it's just a bunch of wood blocks. And in order to change the timbre, you guys see that I have this series of, and I'm going to put my headphones on to make sure that I'm not distorting for you. So we have this series of different mallets, and they have different sizes, different hardnesses, and they permit you, I'm going to turn the mic here, they permit you to bring out different characteristics of the instrument. So I have these arranged kind of in like a soft, medium, hard, and then special category. So you can just hear the difference. So we have our softest one, and these have like a really heavy rubber ball on the inside of it. And we're starting to distort a little bit. I'm going to turn the gain down here. Distortion, remember that, because we're going to talk about that in a moment. And I have a snare drum on in the room. I got to hunt it down. Okay, the offending snare drum has been exterminated. So we have right. We have a really well. Think about what How would you describe that sound? What words would you use? I would use. I'll give you a second to if you want to pause. Like, what would you use? How would you describe that sound? I would call it warm, earthy. It's hard not to also bring in, what the instrument looks like slightly, right? It has a little bit more of a dark characteristic to it. And then we change mallets. And so I'm going to use something that just has a little bit more hardness to it. So hearing them back to back so you can compare. So the sound almost has like a different degree. You guys can't see my face when I'm doing that. The sound has a different degree of focus to it, right? It's kind of like it goes from you could think of it an impressionist painting to something that's a little bit more expressionist. It has a little bit more defined lines and boundaries to the sound, right? And as you might be able to guess, then we can go up a little bit further. Right? So I'm going to play the same little tune with each of those, just so you get to hear the comparison, right? So I picked 3 different examples that would be fairly easy to tell the difference between. But if you notice, I got a lot more mallets here, and that's because there are a lot of different circumstances that I've come across as a player where it's not, one of these was not good enough specifically. It didn't blend well, or the mallet itself was too heavy, and so it produced, too much sound, or it didn't produce enough sound, and it had to balance with other things. Or it may be that I had to play something really fast and I needed something lighter physically, right? So you combine all the different musical and physical situations, and that turns into, an episode of Hoarders right here. You've got a lot of mallets that need to be used. I'm not going to demonstrate all of these, right? But that first one, if you opened it up, it would look kind of like this. This is, if you look closely, is basically natural latex. It's like the bark from a tree that's been wrapped around a stick. Right? Almost didn't demonstrate the trick mallet. So this is called a slap mallet, which is literally just some padding and some leather around it, right? So when we talk about how to differentiate, how to differentiate these different sounds, we start needing better terms. And we're going to talk about those terms. I'll give you a preview. Attack, sustain, decay, right? Beginning, middle, end of the sound. We're going to cover that more in the next talk. But that's how we can start to refer to parts of the sound and like really narrow down like what it is that we like or don't like or need to adjust about a given type of music or a different sound, right? So that was a talk about idiophones, and at the end we talked about how to control the timbre of a given idiophone. So we have, even though we have a wooden sound right there, well, how do you emphasize that? How do you draw out different more wooden characteristics, more liquid characteristics, more glassy characteristics? Those are all timbral decisions that an instrumentalist would make, and that you can seek out as a way to connect with the music that you use and dance to and try to harness as you're listening. Generally, the categories here are wood and metal when we talk about idiophones. And again, they're not adjustable. So now, idiophones, that's the 4th category out of 5, but it's the last acoustic one. The next category we have is electrophones. So electrophones, instruments that are use electronic means to produce sound and music. And it's not uncommon. Well, we can think of a synthesizer as the typical the keyboard synthesizer as the typical electronic instrument. We also have a lot more than that. We have the turntable. We have the electronic wind instrument called an EWI. We have electric guitars, right? We have we have a synclavier, which is an electric piano. We have many different types of electric pianos. So synthesizer is kind of it's almost like an outdated term because it's not specific enough, because there have been so many different directions that people have taken these electronic sounds. The more relevant discussion, though, is actually what we call electro-acoustic music or electro-acoustic sound. And this is where you have the mixture of electronic means of sound production or sound modification with acoustic sound production. I'll say that again because I botched it there for a second. Electroacoustic is mixing acoustic production of sound and electric manipulation of sound, right? All of these can be very well understood by thinking about filters that you can put on pictures and what they can draw out and emphasize and de-emphasize and turn into ideal versions of what the original source was. And we're all very familiar with how sometimes the filtered, adjusted image bears very little resemblance to the truth of the original picture. And that is very true with music as well, and sound. There is a little video I want you to watch of, it's basically a parody of exactly what can go into making something that seemingly sounds natural sound that way instead of how it actually did in the studio pre-production, as we would say, before any changes were made to the sound or improvements or adjustments. So I'm going to list a few of these terms here, and I'm going to try and demonstrate some of them. Actually, this video would have been out 2 days earlier if I had not had to take apart my entire little mixing board that is just to my left over here because of this exact segment of the video. So hopefully it's worth it. The wait was worth it. So we're going to talk about the different electronically driven, created, natured effects that we can call. And effects is a term that you can use to refer in general to any electroacoustic treatment of sound. Effects, kind of like special effects. This is kind of the CGI of music, is what we're talking about. You know, the Photoshop of music. They're very closely related in how they work and how they can kind of fix things and fool you, right, or fool the listener. So first one, and this is the one I was worried about earlier, was distortion or the oversaturation. This happens when you have a signal that's too strong for what the device is that's you're listening through. So, for example, I'll see if I can very gently produce some distortion here. Right. So I have my snare drum here. I will let you see. You'll be able to see the stroke that I'm using, so that you'll see that I'm not playing very large. The stroke size is not going to be very substantial. So right now, I have there's a knob on my mixer that I'm turning down, so my voice is not going to be as loud, but the drum, because the drum is louder than me, I have to turn down the potential. There's a knob on here called gain, right? It's kind of the pre-volume knob when you're talking about being a sound technician. And if you guys ever do any kind of production, you'll know a little bit more about that. But just know that gain has something to do with potential volume. It's kind of like the size of the drum when I was using that story earlier, right? So I'm playing this snare drum. And I'm going to turn up the gain, and you're going to start to hear it distort. You hear that? You hear that? It starts to get a little fuzzy. That is the beginnings of distortion, where the equipment can't handle the tone begins to literally distort. If you're talking about like the waveform, if you were to graph it on a piece of equipment that measures sound. And in mild settings, right, you have sometimes that's a sound you might want. So the other terms that you hear associated with distortion are overdriven, fuzzy, it adds a little bit of noise to it. And it's starting to do what's called clipping, which basically it's reaching a point where it can't get any louder. But I'm going to push it a little further and see what ends up happening to this signal. Wow. Wow. So that gets really distorted. And so that's distortion right there. Now, one of the big deals about distortion is that, well, that's one of the things that makes the electric guitar a unique and powerful instrument, is that it was the first instrument to really use that distortion. When we talk about, Jimi Hendrix in the 60s, he was one of the pioneers of using distortion, using feedback, using things that were not supposed to be happening, shortcomings supposedly of the electronic nature of the amplification. He turned into part of the instrument. He was one of the people that helped to do that. Another thing about distortion is sometimes, here's a real world time where you would encounter that, is if you're plugging your phone or audio playing device into another system and both your phone and the system have volume adjustment options on them, that can result in distortion and overdrive and clipping because things are being pushed too far. We've all taken class on Zoom, and Zoom is designed to handle human voices, so you're never going to encounter, unless you go into the settings, you're never going to encounter distortion. However, if you enable their original sound option or the high fidelity music mode, that can actually make distortion enter into it, to where sound above a certain level turns into noise. Another effect, compression. This is something you can kind of picture what it talks about. It basically narrows the potential volume. So the softs get louder, the louds get softer. Music that has been recorded under compression is easier to listen to in the car, right? Because even though there's a lot of ambient noise going on, the music never dips down too low, or it gets high to where you have to reach for the volume knob and twist it one way or the other. If you want to keep listening to the music at a comfortable and audible level, right? Both of those things are important. Comfortable, right? Not painful or damaging, and audible, meaning like there won't be stretches of time where you're not aware if the music is still going. The last effect that we're going to talk about a little bit here is something you're all familiar with. It's the concept of reverb. And I'm going to bring back the good old snare drum in a moment. And actually, stay tuned after this. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the snare drum there. I realized there was a little bit that I forgot to talk about. So if you wanted to learn a little bit more about membranophones, it'll be an extra minute after this. Reverb is all the sound other than the direct sound source that you hear when sound bounces back to our ears from other surfaces in the environment. So in other words, it's a natural phenomenon that you've all been in, for example, a room that has a lot of hard surfaces on it, and so the voice lasts a lot longer. The decay, the death of the sound takes a lot longer. Reverb can also be added electronically. It adds ambience. It makes you feel a little bit more like you're immersed in the sound, like you have, there's a more livable sound to it. So reverb basically has the effect of making you feel like you're in a different sized space. And so you actually there are different types of reverb. There's room reverb. There is hall reverb, and I'll turn that on now so you can hear a little bit more of what hall reverb sounds like. I could be in a cathedral right now, or any place, museum, a lot of hard surfaces in it. So that's hall, and I have to, this is what I took the piece of equipment apart for, is to do this part here. We have something that's a little bit more subtle. This is called room reverb, so the sound is not quite as long. It doesn't sound like you're in quite as large of a space. That's part of it. And then we also have chamber. And actually these, to my ears, are actually not, the last couple are not sounding terribly different. But basically the idea is these settings can imply different sized spaces. So this would be basically flat, or the smaller space, and as I turn up the reverb, it can sound like I'm in a slightly bigger space until you can't tell. And I'll do that with the drum as well. And this is one of the interesting things that musicians have to learn how to manage, is depending on how long the sound is in the room, they have to adjust how much they play, right? So I'm going to turn down the gain here. I'm sure it would have been more interesting to watch me do that, but you get the point. And I was playing about that far off the drum the entire time. Those are some of the more common effects that you hear. There's echo and delay effects, where you basically, it's kind of a hyper version of reverb, where you hear exactly what you just did coming back to you, right? It's kind of mimicry in the sound, and that's not as much of a timbral change. It's more of a compositional element. It doesn't change the nature of the specific sound. It just repeats it down the line. When you get to see a live guitar player, and they have a whole row of pedals that look like this right here, those are all what we call effects pedals. This one is delay, right? It has that echo capability, but distortion pedals and reverb pedals and all the stuff that we're talking about, they can turn them on, turn them off. So I also wanted to like I mentioned before, talk a little bit about the snare drum, just to go a little bit more in detail, just to help you understand the construction of that instrument. This will take 2 seconds, or slightly longer, but not much longer. So the snare drum is an instrument that could only exist in the drum world, because it has actually, it's kind of part idiophone, part drum. So it has a head on the top, head on the bottom, and it also has these wires right here. And these wires are stretched across. The air ends up hitting, traveling from the top to the bottom. And you can actually see, you might be able to see, the camera's not close enough, but if you look closely enough, you'll see that the wires jump. So the wires are kind of like an idiophone strapped onto a membranophone. So this is kind of a composite instrument, and a snare drum can be turned on or turned off. And then when we're talking about the limitations of this being a very short, dry instrument, well, that's what the drum roll was created to solve. It was created for length. So just a quick demonstration of what a drum roll is. It's multiple bounces on either hand. Right, and that's how you use one hand to kind of mask the gaps between the other hand, right? And that's how you create length in the sound on a drum and in any percussion instrument. It's the roll, and that's the technique. I thought it might be interesting to show that to you. Anyway, more next time when we continue to talk about timbre and then texture.